Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Rosemary Church of Christ on Wednesday night via Facebook. And I hope that you're having a great week. The weather so far this week has been remarkable. Great days to be outdoors. I'm sad to report the forecast for the rest of the week is a bit wet. And so we'll see how all that goes. I am happy to have no more rain for a while, but that's just me. I think what we'll do is take whatever comes our way, and that'll be what we get. We're going to begin a new study tonight, and it will be about the church in Corinth. So 1 Corinthians obviously would be the book that we're going to be in, although that's not where we will be first thing tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit about an introduction in terms of Corinth and Paul and people. And we'll be reading from Acts 18, where Paul is in Corinth, in just a few minutes. But I want to begin with an introduction and tell you a little bit about my father. My dad, as long as I can remember, was what I called the Chrysler man. Now, he only owned one or two cars that were actually the Chrysler. Most of what he owned was Dodge and Plymouth. And with raising 5 kids, we always had a station wagon. And I remember one year, I believe it was 1953, my dad decided to try this new Ford. It was kind of sporty looking for a family guy, and it was a terrible car. It had one problem after another, but he traded in a 1950 or 51 Plymouth station wagon to get this brand new 1953 Ford station wagon. And after a few months of fighting and arguing, he turned it in. They kind of agreed that particular car was a lemon. And he bought another 51 Plymouth station wagon, very similar to the one he had traded in. My dad stayed with that corporation. He found it to be good engineering and a good way to be. He just liked it. And so in December of 1955, my dad and I and my next youngest brother, we got on a train in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and rode the train overnight to Detroit. It was my first time ever on a train at 10 years old. And there we got a taxi cab, my first time in a taxi cab. And we went directly to the Dodge manufacturing plant, and we picked the car up right there at the plant. Dad said, I'm not spending money for the delivery charge. So instead, he took 2 of us boys on a road trip with him via train. And then on the way home, you drive all the way across the Ohio Turnpike and all the way across the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Well, I got to sit in the middle up front, and my dad controlled the gas and the brake. There was no cruise control in 1956. And I got to steer the car a good bit of the way home. I won't say most, but a good bit of the way home. And I just felt like, man, I have arrived. This is the real deal. Well, then in 1976, my father bought a Chrysler Cordoba. And you might recall the Chrysler Cordoba was manufactured 1975 to 1983. It was a 2-door sedan. It was not considered to be a full-size car at that point, but it was sort of the car for the middle-aged man who wanted to say, yes, I've still got it together. And my dad loved that Chrysler Cordoba. But one of the things that convinced him about buying one, from what I remember, were the commercials. And Ricardo Montalban was the spokesperson for Chrysler. And he would talk about this beautiful Chrysler Cordoba with his accent. And he described the interior. The seats were covered with rich Corinthian leather. And I always wondered, what is Corinthian leather? So even at that age, in 1976, I looked it up. Nothing. There is no such thing as Corinthian leather. But it was called that because in ancient times, when Paul is writing this letter to this church, when he is on his mission trips, Corinth is the city to go to for revelry and all kinds of immoral things. It's sort of like combining Mardi Gras with Las Vegas, or Macau over near Southeast Asia, is the gambling capital of Southeast Asia. I'm glad somebody besides me remembers those commercials. I just saw that come up on the scroll. In any case, in the first century, to say someone was Corinthian, or to say it was Corinthianized, was to say that it was evil. Not evil, but sensual. They didn't think of it as evil, but it was about wild parties and all the things that go on in a human endeavor. And so Corinth is the city at that point in time of about 700,000. Probably 200,000 were citizens or free men, free people. The other 500,000 were slaves or in some manner indentured servants. And so it was a city that you had this huge diversity in the population in terms of economics. You had the rich that were wasteful and just terrible in their behavior. And you had the very poor underneath them who took care of all their constant wants. And so to be a Corinthian, or to be accused of being Corinthian-like, was an accusation of wastefulness, of sensuality, of debauchery is a good word, of overindulgence. If we had that in our modern language, we would probably be able to say with accuracy that they were the rich, that is the 200,000 that ruled the city, that they were really, really interested in personal comfort, convenience, and immediate gratification. And so that sounds a whole lot like some of our world today, doesn't it? And that's my point is that humans have not really changed over time. Adam and Eve failed to trust God, and in that process brought a curse upon the world, and we live within the confines of that curse. But it wasn't just them. Noah lived in a time when God said, I'm going to destroy everybody that lives, because the constant thoughts of their heart only turns to wickedness. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. We have Abraham called out of the Ur of the Chaldees, which was the cultural center of his universe at that point in time. We have 12 sons of Jacob who sell their brother into slavery and then are rescued by him. And all the things that were involved there with jealousy and hatred and anger and greed. We come on down a little bit further and we have the period that we just studied, the Judges, and where people just drifted away from God because they were taking care of themselves first. God became a secondary idea in their life, and self became number one. Today I followed a car up Highway 70 here, and it had one of those window stickers that said he, H-E, and then it had the symbol for greater than, and then the letter I. That's a great idea. God is greater than me. And when we forget that, we get into trouble. And that's exactly what was going on in Corinth. But in first century. Today, it's similar. And we're all guilty of this, I guess, at some level. I know I am. I want convenient. I want comfort. I want to create my own safety net. And all of those things, they're fine. They're fine, except they take us away from relying on God. Jesus said in his prayer that we call the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our 401k. No, he didn't say that, did he? Give us this day our guaranteed 5-year contract. He didn't say that either. He said, give us this day our daily bread. When the Jewish people came out of Egypt and they traveled in the wilderness, they had to wait on God to get their daily bread. And they grumbled about the bread, but they knew where it came from. Sometimes I think we can get so far ahead in our life financially and in all the other ways that make us feel good, out of debt, good relationships. We sometimes, I think, tend to forget where those things came from. They come from God. And so the people in Corinth are really no different than we are today. And because they were a part of their culture, because they became Christians within their cultural context, they carry those ideas into the church. Someone has said that the church at Corinth is the church that gave Paul the most trouble, and that is likely true. I'm not debating that point, but I wonder what God would think about us today and Paul's writings and what he had to say. Are we the church of today that gives God and Paul the most trouble? The problems at Corinth are an emphasis of most Bible scholars. I've been reading ahead in it's the Bible study textbook series put together by College Press, and a good gentleman named Paul Butler did this first series here on 1 Corinthians. But listen to how he outlines 1 Corinthians. There are 16 chapters, and this is the way he chose to discuss them. Chapter 1, the problem of division. Chapter 2, the problem of revelation. In other words, who has the best information. Number 3, the problem of ministry. Paul says, I can't talk to you like adults, you're still babies. Then in chapter 4, it's the problem of favoritism and arrogance. In chapter 5, it's a problem of church discipline. In chapter 6, the problem of, he writes and says, it's baseness and brotherhood. And what he's talking about is they all want to be part of the church, but they want to behave and live like they were not, like their neighbors around them. It was a lack of humility, in my understanding. Chapter 7, the problems of sexuality and marriage. By the way, I read something recently that said, marriage is hard. Divorce is hard. You have to choose your hard. And so that's some of the things that Paul talks about in chapter 7. Chapter 8, it's the problem of conscience. What can I do and not offend God and still I'll enjoy it? Chapter 9, the problem of personal freedom. Does that allow me to just do whatever I want to do? In chapter 10, the problem again of arrogance or presumptuousness, of thinking that I've got all the answers put together. Chapter 11, the problem of disorderly worship. Chapter 12, the problem of maintaining unity in the midst of a very diverse group of people. Chapter 13, the problem of maintaining love in the midst of diversity. Chapter 14, the problem of preaching or edification in the midst of diversity, because all of us hear things and learn things and see things through the lenses of our own personal experience. Chapter 15, the problem of the resurrection. And finally, chapter 16, the problem of helping Christian brothers. In other words, what do we do with the money that's in the church treasury, and how do we get it there? Now, I'm not criticizing Brother Butler's outline. It's an adequate outline, but I don't want to do that for this study. We will talk about those problems, but what I want us to look at is not so much the problem as how does God say to work through this and come out the other side as a better church. In other words, what is the solution? I had the opportunity yesterday to work with a young man on a moving project. We helped an elderly woman move from, her husband died, she sold the house, we helped her downsize, and we moved her into an apartment in Fayetteville. But this young man is 23 years old, and he called me on Monday night, and he said, I've got a problem. The person that I thought could take care of my dog can't help me, and I might not be able to go tomorrow. And I said, well, what's the answer to all this? And he thought about it. He said, well, if it would be okay with the people there and I can bring my puppy, it's only about 4 months old. He said, if I can bring the dog with me, I'll just drive my own car and I can come and we can get the job done. I said, it'll be fine, bring the dog. But look at what he did. He saw he had a problem. He faced the problem. He came up with a solution that everybody could live with, and he was able to live as he promised he would do. And I believe that's what I want us to do in this book as we go through it. Yes, we're going to see the problems, but what is the solution? What does Paul say? Here's the better way that God wants us to live. I think that's really the context of what we want to understand. We have the same kinds of problems. We have divisions over the craziest, dumbest things sometimes. We have problems with people's attitude towards others. We have problems with personal freedom, what's okay and what's not okay. And all of that comes through living in the culture we live in. But I believe that God has answers for us that are much more important than simply understanding the problem. So what I'd like to do is jump over to Acts chapter 18 with you tonight and kind of introduce you to Paul's situation as he is in Corinth. The best information I have been able to find indicates that Paul was probably in Corinth at least twice, maybe 3 times, but this first time he's there probably for about a year and a half. So Acts chapter 18, beginning at verse 1. Let me get a little cold water. Acts 18, beginning at verse 1. It says, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome." Now, this has to do with a persecution of the Jewish people by the Roman Emperor, Claudius. It is not the one under Nero, this precedes it. But since Christians, by the Roman government, were considered to simply be another subdivision of the Jewish people, if you were a Christian, you also got kicked out of Rome. And so these two have come from Rome, and Paul went to see them. And because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. But every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now there's an interesting note here. The synagogue was for the Jewish people. But at this synagogue, there were both Jews and Greeks. Perhaps these individuals were like the Cornelius, the centurion that Peter went to his house, that he was a God. They were God-fearers. They had learned about the God of Israel, and while they had not become Jews, they were not circumcised. They were God-fearers, and they were allowed into certain parts of the synagogues. Later on, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. And I think we have a shift here where Paul has been supporting himself financially with tent making, and he's preaching to the Jews in the synagogue on Saturday. But once Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia, which includes places like Philippi and some of the other cities in what is now Turkey, and these folks were able to bring support. And a number of the churches in Galatia and Philippians, Colossians, these folks sent money to Paul to help him maintain his life. So when they came, then Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Now, this is not the first time that Paul has faced opposition. In fact, as he's made his way to Corinth through this trip, he has been beaten, he's been imprisoned, he has suffered all kinds of physical abuse and persecution. And now the Jewish leadership is rising up against him again. And it would give me reason to say, do I really want to stay here? But he does. He says, from now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Now there's the key, a worshiper of God. He was not a Jew, he's a Gentile, but he's a worshiper of the one true God. Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were baptized. So one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Do keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack you or harm you, because I have many people in this city. So Paul stayed for 1.5 years, teaching them the word of God. And we'll pause there for a minute. Think about it. If you were going to choose a place to go where you thought people were receptive to the gospel message of Jesus Christ, where would you choose? Well, we have a lot of choices, don't we? But God says to Paul, who is living in the Las Vegas